In the year 1802, in the damp, trembling dawn of a Virginia plantation, a secret was born before the sun could lay eyes on it. The house was hushed, the fields still, the quarters quiet, but the walls of that big white house seemed to pulse with the tension of something unspeakable. A plantation wife lay weary after a long, wrenching labor, her cries fading under the weight of what she had just brought into the world. Triplets. 3 babies, but not 3 who looked the same. 2 were pale like her husband's line, pale like the world she claimed as her own, but the third bore the unmistakable mark of a truth she could not allow to breathe. He was darker, dark in a way that contradicted the story she wanted to tell, dark in a way that exposed something buried, something forbidden, something that could unravel reputations and shatter illusions. And in that moment, instead of embracing the miracle of life, she reached for the cloak of fear, and fear reached back. She turned to the enslaved woman attending her, a woman whose hands had ushered countless children into this world, whose strength held the plantation's fragile order together more than any man's whip ever could. This woman, already weary from a life of servitude, found herself standing in the crosshairs of someone else's shame. The mistress fixed her with a trembling glare, half terror, half fury, and gave an order that carried the chill of death. Hide him, hide the darkest one. The room froze. History froze, morality froze, and in that frozen moment, she pushed her sin onto the shoulders of a woman who already carried the weight of generations. Can you imagine the breath leaving that enslaved mother's lungs? Can you feel the way her heart must have cracked open, torn between obedience demanded by fear and compassion demanded by God? This wasn't just a child. This was a newborn with a cry as soft as any other, eyes searching for warmth, limbs stretching toward life. Yet the mistress looked at him not as a baby, not as a gift, not as a soul, but as a threat. A mirror she dared not look into. A truth she wanted buried before it ever had a chance to speak. And the enslaved woman stood there, trembling between 2 worlds, the one that commanded her to silence and the one deep within her spirit that whispered of justice, of fairness, of the God who sees what humans try to hide. When she lifted that baby in her arms, she wasn't just lifting a child. She was lifting a crossroads, a moment on which destinies could turn. She felt his tiny heartbeat, quick and fragile, pulsing against her own. She knew he was innocent. She knew he had done nothing but arrive into a corrupt world. But she also knew what the mistress was capable of. She knew what the master would do if he ever laid eyes on this child who bore the truth of their household's sin. She knew the price of disobedience, the price of honesty, the price of black flesh on soil that treated it as property. And she found herself, in that moment, standing at the intersection of fear and faith, of survival and righteousness, of a command given by a trembling woman and a purpose whispered by a mighty God. We gather today not just to talk about a story from 1802, but to wrestle with a question that still echoes in our world. What happens when people try to hide what God has exposed? What happens when truth comes into the world through innocent hands, and the powerful scramble to bury it? Because no matter how tightly someone tries to seal a secret, no matter how deeply they try to hide a sin, truth has a way of rising. It rises like morning light slipping under a locked door. It rises like a baby's cry that refuses to be swallowed by shame. It rises like hope in the heart of the oppressed. Picture that enslaved woman, stepping out of the room, the baby wrapped against her chest. She felt the eyes of the house track her movement, felt suspicion trailing behind her like a shadow. Every step carried danger, every breath carried fear, but she also carried a child who did not ask to be hidden. A child who did not ask to be erased. A child whose mere existence confronted a system built on lies, exploitation, and the illusion of superiority. And she walked, heart pounding, toward the quarters where the truth could not be denied, because the people there had long learned to recognize hidden pain, hidden children, hidden stories forced into silence. Rumors moved faster than footsteps on plantations. Whispered truths slipped between cabins like wind. Before the sunset touched the tops of the trees, the people on that land knew what had happened in that big house. They knew about the triplets. They knew about the command to hide the darkest child. And they knew exactly what it meant. It meant that the lines drawn by the slave system, lines meant to divide human from human, soul from soul, were lies. It meant that the bloodlines of the oppressor and the oppressed were more tangled than anyone dared say aloud. It meant that the plantation wife's terror was not just of the child's color but of the reality it revealed. that the master's sins were crawling out of the shadows and into daylight. But even then, even in the midst of secrecy and fear, there was something powerful happening. That baby, tiny, vulnerable, unwanted by the woman who birthed him, became a living reminder that truth does not die just because someone is uncomfortable with it. The enslaved woman who carried him became a vessel of protection in a place designed to break her. And the community around her became witnesses to a truth the plantation tried desperately to suppress. This is where God often begins his work, not in grand halls, not on thrones, not in places of prestige, but in the shadows where the broken gather, where the oppressed whisper hope to one another, where discarded things become divine instruments. God specializes in taking what others try to hide and using it to reveal what must be confronted. He specializes in elevating the forgotten, the silenced, the hidden, and the unwanted. He specializes in turning a child nearly erased into a message that refuses to fade. So as we step deeper into this story, understand that we are not just recounting history. We are naming a pattern. We are naming a truth. For every era has its hidden children, its buried truths, its attempts to conceal the uncomfortable. Every age has people who fear the consequences of exposure more than they fear the judgment of God. But every age also has people, often the marginalized, often the wounded, often the overlooked, whom God uses to carry truth forward even when the powerful demand silence. The enslaved woman did not know what her decision would cost her. She did not know how long she could protect that child. She did not know whether the mistress would come storming after her with rage in her eyes or whether the master would demand an explanation. But she knew one thing: some things are too sacred to hide. Some truths are too divine to bury. Some children carry too much purpose to be swept away like dust. And when she stood there with that baby pressed against her heart, she felt something shifting not just in her life, but in the air around her. She felt the presence of a God who sees the unseen. She felt the weight of a story bigger than the plantation, bigger than Virginia, bigger than the year 1802. She felt the whisper of justice humming beneath the soil. And church, that is where our journey begins today, with the understanding that the truths people try to hide are often the ones God most intends for us to confront. We begin with a child they tried to conceal, a woman they tried to silence, and a truth they tried to bury. We begin with a moment where one command, hide him, collided with a greater command, protect life, honor truth, and trust the God who sees it all. This is not just history. This is a mirror. This is a warning. This is an invitation to stand in the light even when others tremble in the shadows.